Unfortunately, I used to be like that very easily. And they didn't used to. They used to actually not even warn you, so it's better now that they warn you. Anyways, I was just talking to Rob, who I didn't know that you had there. No, I'm actually here to be here, so I get that. Okay. Oh, that's the one. Sorry, I don't like that.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Atlanta Council. My name is Barry Pavel. I'm the director of the Brent Scowcroft Center here and a vice president for the council. We're thrilled to welcome you to our event, Smart Designs for Smart Homes, for the launch of a new issue brief. Interesting topic that will be increasingly prevalent in our daily lives, but also with broader implications. It is Thursday, and this afternoon's conversation is part of our monthly Cyber Risk Wednesday series. I'm going to go home tonight and try to figure that out. It's Thursday, but it's Wednesday. But it's the series, as many of you know, if you've come every month, is designed to convene cyber experts from various sectors to examine topics at the core of the council's cyber mission. Today is a special Cyber Risk Thursday because it's my great pleasure to announce that one of today's panelists, Joshua Corman, will be starting tomorrow, April 1st, as the new director of our Cyber Statecraft Initiative. And even though it's April 1st, that is a true statement. Josh is also the co-founder. No one's happier than me about that. Josh is also the co-founder of I Am the Cavalry. It's a grassroots organization that encourages new security approaches in cyberspace and beyond in response to the world's increasing dependence on digital infrastructure. So sort of watch this space. The program will be heading more in the direction of today's conversation, but even much further. Josh has employed a very unique approach to security and policy by connecting human factors, adversary motivation, social impact to help position him as really one of the most trusted names in this space. Before joining the council, he served as the Chief Technology Officer for Sonatype, an adjunct faculty member for Carnegie Mellon's Heinz College, and a fellow at the Ponemon Institute. We are really thrilled to have him. Before I let Josh take the stage for his remarks, I'd also like to thank our media partner Passcode from the Christian Science Monitor for joining us, and welcome those of you who are following the conversation online. I encourage all of you to join the conversation on Twitter using our hashtag @ACCyber, as well as @CSMPasscode. And Josh will give you another account to also tweet from. And now, Josh, over to you. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you for all coming. My name's Joshua Corman. I'm very excited that at least for the next hour, I'll still be the Chief Technology Officer of Sonatype, but I'm really excited to start tomorrow. I think at a really key point in history. About 3 years ago, we decided to try to do this I am the cavalry thing. And in some ways, it's a terrible name. In other ways, it's a wonderful name. But what we had found is that we were growing more concerned that our dependence on connected technology was growing much, much faster than our ability to secure it. And while many of the best and brightest in the cybersecurity realms were trying to protect credit cards and highly replaceable assets, we saw that this dependence was now permeating our automobiles, our medical devices, our homes, the Internet of Everything. And since we're putting software and connectivity into every aspect of our life, what we know in cybersecurity is once you add software, you make something hackable. And once you connect it to something else, you make it exposed. So to me, the Internet of Things, it's not that software was eating the world, it was really that software was infecting the world. And if we were going to place our dependence upon it, we really needed to make sure it was dependable and worthy of trust. So the name came from the recognition that the cavalry isn't coming, and it was a call to action to the voice of reason and technical literacy in the research community to say, stop waiting for someone to come solve this for you. Look to your left, look to your right. If they're not sitting in your chair, they're not coming. So it was really a personal attestation that I'm the cavalry. I will be part of the solution. And the idea was to get outside our comfort zone and go talk to public policymakers, the general public, and affected industries where bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. We really wanted to focus on the intersection of technology and the human condition, but more specifically where the consequences of failure included public safety and human life. And without much of a plan other than boldly going in that direction, we started fuzzing the chain of influence and meeting with people in Washington and going to places that we didn't normally go and speaking with people we didn't normally speak with. But really with empathy at its core and the heart of an ambassador, we've tried to bridge the divide between the technical community and the policy community. And in just the last 3 years of experimentation, we've already seen the fruits of that labor. In fact, right here on this stage, last March, I met Suzanne Schwartz from the Food and Drug Administration, which really catalyzed a very high trust, high collaboration relationship. And if any of you saw this January's post-market guidance for connected medical devices, they've now done a complete 180 in their attitude towards security researchers, now essentially almost requiring that medical device manufacturers have a positive relationship with research community by encouraging the adoption of coordinated disclosure programs for vulnerability research. So we have seen the experiment work, and what's become clear in the meantime is that if you look at the headlines, this has gone from a concern that we're worried about on the horizon to one that's happening in real time. Just the week before the RSA Security Conference, we saw the hack of the Nissan Leaf. We saw the first self-driving car have an accident. It may have been at 2 miles an hour, but Google did hit a bus. More recently, we saw ransomware be so debilitating to a hospital in Hollywood, California, that they had to move patients, affecting safety and patient care, potentially of critical care patients. And now we're seeing yet another one, which is now actively probing other hospitals. So whether they're targeted attacks or indiscriminate collateral damage, this dependence in areas affecting public safety and human life are really coming to the forefront. I was just in Munich for the security conference discussing how maybe this isn't about norms and treaties between nation states, but maybe we should also be looking at our cyber safety exposure to subnationals, ideological adversaries, activists, people maybe with less resources and less hacking skill than the will and might of a nation state, but with more willpower to use it and assert their will onto others. And as you've seen recently, we saw the unsealed documents confirming some Iranian hackers manipulating controls in a water facility. So if not now, then when? And what I'm really excited about coming here and today's topic is someone has to fill this void, and we have to act quickly to know what the right, thoughtful, and planful response will be to cyber safety. And I'm really honored to be picking up where Jason Healy left off with the Cyber Statecraft Initiative and really bring a heavy focus into cyber safety. Because this is not only going to be measured, the impact won't simply be measured in public safety and human lives, but also in confidence in key markets like automotive, like medical. And if we'd like to avail ourselves of the safety advances we could get from connected vehicles, or if we'd like to improve the state of patient care through use of modern technology, a critical element of that is that the public trusts these technologies. And it's up to us in this room to drive that conversation and make sure we don't wait for a really serious failure that scares people away from trusting these technologies, but we preserve and deserve the trust that we've already placed upon them. So in today's installment, we'd like to talk about a paper that was originally a collaboration between members of Eye on the Cavalry, Bo Woods and myself, and the Atlantic Council with Greg Lindsay on smart homes. And while there are several reasons to look at safety and privacy in the home with ever-connected consumer electronics and home alarm systems and appliances, et cetera. And while there are promises, we want to make sure that in our desire to adopt these new technologies, we can maintain the trust and confidence in them so that we don't have a nightmare scenario. The report came out today, and if you haven't looked at it, if you read one and only one thing, please look at the scenario from 2025 with the haunted house. But we're going to get into that a little bit on the panel here. So without further ado, I'm very excited to do my first panel here at the Atlantic Council in a different role. And let's invite our panelists up to the stage, please. We can clap for them while I do so. All right. All right. And I'll go down the line here. Please wave your hand, Greg Lindsay. Okay. And Andrea Matwishin, and Bo Woods, the Deputy Director for the Cyber Statecraft Initiative. So would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Greg Lindsay. I'm a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council within Scowcroft's Strategic Foresight Initiative, so the sister initiative to Cyber Statecraft. And I'm also a senior fellow at the New Cities Foundation. I'm a contributing writer at Fast Company, and a variety of other sort of posts regarding cities, technology, and various risks.
Okay, and once we go down the line, we're going to give them each a few opening remarks. Andrea Matwishin?
I'm Andrea Matwishin. I'm a professor of law and computer science by courtesy at Northeastern University. I'm also a visiting research collaborator at the Center for Information Technology Policy at Princeton and an affiliate scholar of Stanford Law School Center for Internet and Society. I also had the privilege of serving in 2014 as the Federal Trade Commission's senior policy advisor focusing on security and privacy and their academic in residence.
And Bo Woods.
Unfortunately, I've got to follow that intro. So I'm Bo Woods, the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council Cyber Statecraft Initiative. I've got about 10 years in more on the technical side, and now for the past couple of years working with Eye on the Cavalry, coming more to the policy-making side.
Okay. All right, so we're going to start with Greg and give us some framing thoughts on the idea of smart homes, the promise, the peril. How do you see this issue?
Yeah, I mean, so my way into writing about this, I've been covering really the notion of smart cities was my way into this issue. I started covering it when IBM really had its sort of big breakthrough in 2008, right after the election of President Obama and the financial crisis, when really there was a whole shift in the whole language around how we start approaching what is now the whole discourse around the Internet of Things. So when you look at smart homes, it's really interesting historically because it's always been an extremely tech-heavy marketed campaign. There's no organic reason to want a smart home. I mean, if you go back to the 1930s, the first visions of the smart home started appearing in various magazines like Electrical Experimenter, published by the likes of like Hugo Gernsback, Popular Mechanics, Pop Science. That trickled into visions in the 1960s of the Jetsons, the World's 64-65 World's Fair, Walt Disney, these notions of these push-button automated homes that were relieve us from drudgery. And by the 1980s, you saw the big tech companies like Microsoft and others were pushing this idea that the future of computing was the smart home, the home of tomorrow, and was filled with all these stillborn visions of like how we would basically automate our homes to the nth degree. Consumers never really wanted them. And it was only, and we saw, this elaborate push to try to create these elaborately interoperable networked homes. And of course, they were buggy, they were brittle. I mean, taking, great analog systems and making them harder to use. I mean, the real problem with smart homes, separate from hacking and worms and everything else we're going to get into, is just the notion that we all remember that time in the early 1990s when, it was even odds that we couldn't make our computers work with our printers. The question becomes, do you want your house to operate the exact same way? And this, of course, led consumers to never really embrace it. And that's where we've reached the point. Intel Security, which you might have seen the press release out there, polled 9,000 people around the world, asking about their appetite for smart homes. And the Americans in that study who've lived with this vision the longest, 45% of them could see no reason at all why they would want to have a smart home. And and by far the number one reason why they would want it had to do with cost savings around electricity, around utilities. And so even today, this notion that we're going to live in these beautiful, perfect, seamless homes made of glass, where everything is a touchscreen surface, people just want cheaper electricity bills. So in many ways, we're still looking for that first real killer app for what the smart home can be. And part of the paper, was we have a whole nightmare scenario in there, which Josh mentioned about what it's going to be like living in one of these haunted houses, made haunted by hackers and worms and everything else. But it just boils down to the question of how can we realize the promise of it? How do we actually make good on this vision? And what will those products be? Will it be the Tesla Powerwall? Will it be electric cars that'll free us from grid dependence and lead to more sustainable lifestyles? I think the jury's still out on that, and hopefully we can discuss some of it.
Now, Bo, you were a co-author, so we'll let you go next on some framing remarks.
All right, yeah, so one of the things in doing the research for this that became really clear really quickly is looking at the statistics, some of the statistics that Intel announced today, for instance, but also some of the other work that's been done in the space. It became really clear that while consumers have an expectation that they will have to have these devices, they're terrified of them, right? Something like 66% are afraid that their smart devices are going to be hacked and that the data in them will be essentially extracted out of their homes for some kind of a commercial value by an unwanted intruder, right? That's a pretty scary number for anybody who's trying to sell into that market. So one of the biggest things, as Josh highlighted early on, is we're already starting to trust these devices. In smart homes, clearly, consumers don't necessarily trust them. They may not want them, but they feel like they're going to have to buy them. And in going around to some of the other places, some of the other industries like the automotive industry, like the medical device industry, every auto conference I go to now, people say, oh, I don't want one of these new cars. It's hackable. I'm going to get an old car from the 70s or 80s, and I'm going to drive that around because that'll be way safer. It's like, no, it won't. That's the opposite thing, right? In medical, you see people like diabetes patients, like Jay Radcliffe, who have said, I don't trust this device to work in a way that's automated that can affect my body chemistry. I'm going to go back to injecting myself 15 to 20 times a day with insulin. These are personal choices that those people make, but in aggregate, those personal choices have a really significant potential impact on the market share that organizations think they're going to get from some of these investments that they've made in Internet of Things and smart home devices. So if you're especially a Kickstarter-sized project and you think you've got a $10 million potential pipeline, but that ends up only being $1 million, then you go out of business, right? Your business model won't sustain a 90% degradation of your market. It's the same thing for larger players, only with less severe consequences to their business model. But some of those internet-connected things that they're creating may go offline. You may not have the products and services associated with the smart home that you thought you would when you bought it, because there's going to be financial impacts if we don't recognize and realize the market potential that exists for these, or the projected market potential. So I think that's one of the kind of hidden bad things that could come up in 2 to 3 years, is we start to see some of the significant investments that have been made by corporations, by cities, in connecting everything go away, and they're not realized, and that has a significant financial consequence to U.S. as well as to global product makers and the markets.
Indeed. All right. And what about you, Andrea?
So following up on the excellent points that Bo made, I'll highlight one competition concern and one consumer protection concern. On the competition side, following those comments, there is currently a deficit of market information to allow consumers to make informed decisions across devices. For example, pricing structures and disclosures with products don't currently usually disclose what the planned obsolescence life cycle is of a particular product. How many years will the product be patched? How many times have penetration tests been run? The quality of the security and the code integrity in a particular device is not necessarily something that a reasonable consumer can take into account when trying to decide whether this product that costs $15 more is worth that extra $15 versus this other product when they're both the same, apparently the same IoT device with respect to functionality. So thinking about those hidden costs and whether the market is rewarding IoT companies that are investing in security and taking care of the consumers that are trusting those products with access to their homes and information. So that's a competition point. On the consumer protection side, there's a bigger conversation and playing up on some of the other comments about the question of what I call technology suitability, or more colloquially I call it the better with bacon problem. Sometimes the fancier technology is not necessarily the better technology for getting a particular task accomplished. I say better with bacon because as some perhaps overzealous chefs think that if they sprinkle bacon on everything, it's suddenly that much better. But if your diner is a vegetarian, you've just stealthily destroyed the diner's meal, right? So thinking through what task are we trying to accomplish when we're bringing a device into our home or into our enterprise, and how those connections facilitate or add risk to the bigger picture of our lives. So let's just quickly take an example. Let's say that I'm a State Department employee and I live in DC and I'm out shopping and I see this really neat connected oven with an app, and I can operate my oven from my phone. Gee whiz, that's kind of cool. But thinking through how the oven connects to my Wi-Fi network, what kinds of information I access from home with respect to my professional life, whether there's sensitive information that could potentially be compromised if the security on my internet-connected oven is not necessarily up to par, and whether vulnerabilities are getting patched. We've already seen the first internet ovens, they exist, and the first vulnerabilities on internet ovens. But wholly apart from the data control aspect, if you have a small child in the home, for example, and the child likes to play with your phone, maybe an internet-connected oven with an easily accessible app is not necessarily the best choice for your home at that point in time in your life. So thinking through the totality of circumstances and how the technology capabilities of particular devices, IoT devices that you bring into your home, connect with those tasks and risks that are the realities of your existence. That's the consumer protection side of this puzzle. So on the one hand, we want to reward the companies in the marketplace that are doing a great job and thinking about security and protecting consumers. And on the other hand, we want to train consumers to help themselves be informed and make good purchasing decisions of those products that are the higher quality IoT products.
Okay, thank you. So speaking of that, when we had launched the Cavalry initially, we talked about 4 different projects because they had 4 different markets, 4 different sets of regulators, 4 different market dynamics. One was automotive cyber safety. One of them was medical cyber safety. One was industrial controls and public infrastructure, which is a very large and difficult grab bag that you've probably been researching. And the last was consumer and IoT in the home. And we kind of put the IoT in the home on the back burner because with a focus on public safety and human life, we said, well, we love our privacy. We'd like to be alive to enjoy it. And more of the mortal or life and limb kind of consequences were found in the others. But it was a very exciting opportunity to work with the Atlantic Council and with Greg on this because it forced us to stretch which models have we been using to solve some of the problems Andrea just outlined for cars and medical devices. Many of you have seen these, but we had a 5-star automotive cyber safety framework for connected vehicles that we published on our first birthday in August of 2014. And while it has fancy names, the way I would describe it casually to my neighbor is all systems fail. Please tell your customers how you avoid failure, how you take help avoiding failure without suing the helper, how do you capture, study, and learn from failure, how do you have a prompt and agile response to failure, and how do you contain and isolate failure. And then more recently, this January, Bo published the Hippocratic Oath for Connected Medical Devices, which is spiritually similar. When we tried to apply it to smart homes, and we're going to have this as a question, this is your warning, what we found is those controls are useful, but there were additional market enablers and actionable information to customers that were required. So the teaser to the audience is start thinking of what you would do to help the consuming public avoid products that may endanger their family's safety or privacy. And we're going to pose the same question to our panelists, which I'm going to join now. All right. So, first question. If we got smart homes right, and this is a jump ball to anyone, if we got it right, I know you've been a little skeptical that we can get a smart home right, or that it's been a big letdown. What's the primary use case that you'd want to see out of an intelligently connected home? Anyone?
I'll go first. Going through and looking at some of this, I really like the convenience features of some of the smart home stuff. I don't have an Amazon Alexa device to tell me when to reorder and automatically reorder, but that kind of thing appeals to me because I'm sometimes absent-minded, right? And I forget to buy detergent, forget to buy laundry detergent. So if I could have a way to just like say into the air, Alexa, buy laundry detergent, and it will automatically refill it, then that would be really easy for me. It would mean that I could, show up to work with clean clothes, maybe one day, when it wouldn't have happened otherwise. So for me, I think that convenience factor is really where the sweet spot is for smart homes. Not necessarily to automate my decision-making process, but to make it easier to act on those decisions and to help inform that process.
Anyone else?
I'll take it. I slightly disagree with Bo in the sense of I think I agree in the sense that convenience is the reason it's going to happen. So the cognitive dissonance that you cited earlier, I think about the fact that everyone anticipates a smart home will happen, but they're terrified of it and they don't know how. I think that actually is an extension that comes out of the framework that exists now by Facebook, Google, and others, which is, we harvest your data exhaust and we resell it to others. If the service is free, the product is you. And so, Bruce Sterling, the science fiction author, has written about this in his book, The Epic Struggle of the Internet of Things, where, he looks at the internet-enabled fridge, which is like the icon of failed dreams of the smart home. And really, the true Internet of Things fridge is one supplied by Amazon for free, or at least at cost to you, in exchange for them harvesting data. And you won't need to tell Alexa that you ran out of detergent because Amazon already has the patent on predictive ordering, so it will simply use everything it gets from you to fine-tune its patents to ship you things before you even occurred to buy them. So I think that's one of the problems is like convenience is going to be able to create this data regime, this data capitalist regime, which is all about harvesting your personal information. And that's going to lead, I think, to the vulnerabilities that we have and some of the use cases about it. I'm personally most excited about, I think, some of the stuff around home utilities and energy stuff. I think the most exciting consumer product that's come out in a while is the Tesla Powerwall, which is interesting because they've already canceled the larger capacity version of it. But the notion of actually doing what's been talked about for literally 35 years by people like Amory Lovins at Rocky Mountain Institute to create more sustainable, resilient microgrids to really enable the shift to more renewable solar-powered energy because you have home storage products and you can feed into electric cars. That leads to a really sort of interesting shift in how we produce and consume energy that has all sorts of interesting implications for climate change and other sorts of really strategic issues for the United States. So I don't know. I like to think that it'll be that.
For me, I think the best case scenario is a home where the IoT gadgets are totally personalizable, totally customizable, because the assumptions that work for, say, the majority of people don't necessarily work for all people. For example, I travel a lot, and so if I had automatic reordering of certain things, there would be a constant pile of rancid food and various products sitting outside my door blocking entry, a fire hazard, and probably my neighbors would all hate me. So there are individualized needs that consumers have, whether it's to facilitate their engagement with a particular product or because their life is structured a certain way or because they have a special limitation on their environment because of a particular other human in the home or their own physical challenges that they have. There's a need for customization that sometimes is absent in some IoT devices. So I think my ideal IoT home would be one where human overrides existed on all the things, and the devices would allow me to tell them what I want them to do, not assume that they know what I want them to do.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I think I've always been interested in the power savings and the smart meters and the Nest dynamically picking the cheapest price for me, et cetera, and that kind of an idea. Execution's been a little different.
Yeah.
One that I've struggled with is I thought there was a lot of promise in smarter use of networked sensors for home security. Stunningly, though, I've been very disappointed to find that nearly every Bluetooth door lock or automated high-tech home security system has been compromised by one of our friends. In fact, I don't think they've failed yet on any of the equipment that they've tried. So it's ironic that the devices we buy to keep bad guys out of our homes may in fact be the very attack vector that lets them into our homes. So we talked about some nightmare scenarios in here in this dystopian future, but what do you think the most likely realistic first hack is? I know we've had some baby monitors screaming. What's likely to be compromised first in the near term in a smart or over-connected home? Again,
I'll take that one again.
All right.
First. So if you've read the news lately about hospitals, you've seen that ransomware is a big thing, and compromising devices to be able to monetize that. And one of the things that I think I started looking at and thinking about early on is if you've got a fridge that has a monitor on it, that might be hackable, right? And if I have your attention span for 2 seconds, I'm going to serve you an ad, right? So whether the product maker intends that to be the outcome or whether somebody hijacks that process to then serve you ads when you're opening the fridge to get milk, maybe it serves you an ad for a different milk brand or something like that. But I would expect that type of a driver to be the first catalyst for somebody to want to hack a smart home device, is to be able to advertise to you. If you do it in the right way, I don't want to give any ideas, but if you do it in the right way, it's going to be undetectable from normal operation of the device. Somebody's just going to say, oh, well, you know, this fridge, they must have updated the software and now they're selling me ads. I don't like that, right? And you're going to think that it's the manufacturer that did it. So again, there's going to be some brand reputational impact. You could also see a similar thing accomplished, not by actively reaching out to change something, but one of these smart homes makers goes under, or they forget to renew their website and somebody just goes and buys the domain name, right? Now they have complete control of the infrastructure that your smart device is connecting back to. And they could, again, change the firmware, do whatever. If they just put a file out there and your fridge goes and retrieves it and pulls it back down, that might be totally legal. I don't know. I mean, it's conceivable. We have someone who knows or would be able to tell us, but it's conceivable that that's totally legal. It's just somebody forgot to renew the domain name. So I think that would probably be my first expectation, would be somebody would hijack it to serve ads or to have some other financial mechanism.
Yeah, I think a lot of people look at the device themselves or how you could manipulate sensors and actuators, but most of these Internet of Things have some sort of back-end harvesting or storage or configuration. So the amount of information gleanable about you through any of these, even if they never touch your device, could be interesting on the back end. Anyone else?
I don't know if it'll be the first, but I think one that'll happen, I think one of the most interesting ones that'll happen will be one that isn't a hack at all. It'll just simply be an extension of the logic of how the stuff develops. And that's the notion, Tim O'Reilly, publishes all the O'Reilly books, has said, that if the business model of Web 1.0 was advertising, then Web 2.0, or this, Internet of Things, is going to be insurance. And there's another saying, I forget who said it, that, that in the future, every piece of data is a piece of credit score data. And there's a whole raft of startups that are basically basically using, who you're friends with on Facebook, all of your interaction patterns, using that to figure out your actual financial viability. So one of the things I put into the nightmare scenario, which is not even really a nightmare, it's just simply an extension of this, is the notion is something borrowed from Philip K. Dick's Ubik, from the 1970s, in which his protagonist can't open his door because he's behind on payments to his landlord. So he has to unscrew the door off the hinges. And we can start to imagine, that in the future we're like, we're basically, you're behind, or your credit score simply says you're unviable to run this smart home, where essentially you're locked in your house until you agree to actually pay your back bills. In the first draft of the nightmare scenario, we imagine you actually had to turn your power off during the day, and you'd crawl out the one window that you had not turned into a smart window. And we can start to see this. And this is a logic that comes out of, for example, right now, Uber drivers who are taking vehicles, that are financed by Uber, they fall behind on their payments. Their cars are basically switched off remotely, and they're unable to drive from Uber. I mean, we're already sort of see these sort of systems evolve where there's punitive punishments if you're unable to actually conform to, the terms of service, financial terms of service. So it'll be interesting, you think you own a smart home, but we know from things like, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that in the future your entire house will simply be a license from the software companies you have. And if you fail to agree to the term, if you fail to meet the terms of service on this, you will suddenly be shut out of your house by, not even hackers, but by the actual companies that supplied it to you.
I think we can also assume that the techniques for marketing that we've seen used in the smartphone space will extend naturally to all of the IoT devices. So, for example, there are currently some enforcement actions potentially in progress relating to apps that surreptitiously / somewhere buried in the end user license agreement received consent to, ? Turn on the microphone on your phone in order to monitor your TV viewing habits in your living room. Now, undoubtedly, you will have additional information also being collected about the private conversations that are happening in the room, and we had some smart TVs behaving in similar ways through the remote control collecting information with a microphone. So I think it's reasonable to extrapolate for marketing purposes that all of the devices will look for new streams to commodify the information that they have access to. Short of voluntarily binding themselves to never do this in some sort of non-amendable way in the contracts, I think it's reasonable to expect that most of our IoT devices are planning on that secondary stream of income. And to the example of the locked up cars, we also had, in a consumer scenario, we had creditors who were cutting the engines on some cars while the debtors were driving, and that caused some safety issues. And so while a car is maybe not strictly part of an IoT home, though it sits in the garage, it's vaguely connected, it's all part of this bundle of IoT devices that have remote access capability, not only for the consumers, but for the authors of the code. And that creates a wrinkle in some of the traditional relationships of control that consumers have come to expect with respect to the products that they purchase.
Yeah, I'll give an exotic one and then a more mundane one. But as soon as I learned of all the cost savings you could have with the intelligent thermostats like from Nest, thank goodness we're good guys, but we had the idea of essentially small manipulations on a large population of Nest devices to essentially pump and dump based on investment in energy sources in the region. So you can make a significant amount of money very, very quickly by making small adjustments en masse to many homes' consumption of electricity. So that's the more exotic one. I think one of the more prosaic but more troubling ones is think how many devices right now are connected in your home to the Wi-Fi. Just try to, is it 5, is it 10, is it larger than last year, and how many will be there in a couple years? If you look just at the home router, their Wi-Fi routers, about half of the original infection of Heartbleed, the OpenSSL flaw that made most of you reset your passwords in many of your banking institutions or your social media accounts, about half of the original infection spread were unpatchable. So you had devices that were vulnerable to the attack but could not be remediated at all. And a lot of these devices that were exposed and vulnerable, you may not have known they were even running this or connected. So I'm more worried about the zombie or the leper colony of these devices where any one of them that fails now has privileged access as a stepping stone to every other part of my home network, including more sensitive work material, cameras that monitor my children, the front side camera on my television without turning the light on. I'm actually looking for devices that aren't smart. I want to have a market for traditional dumb devices in some cases.
And that kind of goes to my competition point, that as we're marching bravely forward into this world of IoT, it's not only about consumer choice among IoT devices, it's about consumer choice with respect to how technologically connected these devices are. Losing the bottom end of the not connected devices, that's a form of impoverished consumer choice, and our marketplace becomes impoverished if we eliminate the ability to have a less vulnerable option when we need it. And of course, the scenario of the home and having just one device be a point of compromise, not only is it the information on your home network, but if you're that State Department employee that I referenced, that attacker who accesses your network through that one unpatched security camera can then potentially follow you onto your employer's network. Because if you are accessing that network from your home network, they can piggyback on, and suddenly they are not only obtaining your privileged information, but the privileged information of your employer. And depending on who your employer is, that could be national security information, right? So we've seen accidental compromises happen by consumers who are simultaneously government employees, for example. When we look at the Sony DRM rootkit problem from circa 2005, where these CDs had some code on them that was intended to be digital rights management code, but in reality it was coded in such a way that it opened a security hole in every system that the CD was played in. DoD employees played CDs in their work machines. Other government employees played those CDs in their work machines. The employees clearly never intended to cause a security problem for their employer. They were just trying to listen to some music. The same way consumers will certainly never intend for their comical cyber toaster that they've just purchased on a whim to cause a security problem for their government employer with sensitive information.
Well, there's some really interesting points that come out of that. I was just at an event at the New York Auto Show last week, and we were discussing some of the security issues around this. One of the things is that, yeah, they had discovered, I believe, a backdoor into one of the various cars where, yes, it's exploiting the CDs again, where various character strings in the CDs, you could pop it into the CD player, and suddenly you could unlock access to the systems below. So that's very interesting. And also, you bring up, it's funny you bring up, the notion of purchasing, your cyber toaster on a whim, because, there's been this really interesting proliferation of interesting sites, I think, like Wish.com and some others that sell really inexpensive Chinese manufactured goods coming out of the Pearl River Delta and elsewhere. We don't know the total provenance of it, and we can start to imagine all sorts of really interesting sort of, state actor level stuff where you can just push a profusion of compromised devices out there that can then basically create sort of Trojan horses into the homes where you're now buying this for $5 off your mobile phone, your poo emoji that you have there that lights up in your house, and suddenly it's basically hacked into your wireless network. So that's been discussed by August Cole and the Future of War initiative here in Ghost Fleet, but now we can start imagining this sort of stuff into their house.
Yeah, and I think also about a month ago, and I forget who it was, but someone in the law enforcement apparatus of the U.S. government said, "We love this Internet of Things proliferation. We can't wait to use it to find the flaws, map them, use them to track down, identify, surveil potential criminals." Well, kind of extending that, a few years ago, DoD forbid any use of USB sticks.
That's right.
Because they said, well, these could potentially be gateways to transfer malware into sensitive networks. Well, now does that mean the DoD is going to issue a new memo saying you can't have any smart home devices? Going back to an earlier point, what's that going to do for the market of smart home devices when now maybe potentially DoD or any state U.S. employee might be forbidden from buying certain classes of device because they're so poorly secured over the life cycle, right? So that's one of those things that could become a wicked problem in the future is what are the interrelations that we can't even think about or expect right now that will come about 10 years down the line based on choices, design choices and purchasing choices that we make today.
I think there's an interesting cognitive dissonance in security professionals, even the military, where we have incredibly strict guidelines, physical security access, what technology you can use, what kind of systems can access the network, and we're very, very locked down. And then people bring their laptop home or their work home, and we're incredibly lax there. I remember one Christmas there's a big story about the digital picture frames at Best Buy were certified pre-owned from China, to quote Mudge. But this is not a rare occurrence, especially on the lower end of the devices and the consumer. So I remember having to leave all my electronics at a military base, and I couldn't bring anything in. But the general I was speaking with had a rotating set of pictures on his desk on his digital frame, and I said, "So why is that allowed in here?" So this isn't simply about your home; it's about any of these consumer-grade electronics. If I were a hacker trying to do, I don't know, competitive industrial espionage, I would absolutely compromise the microphone capabilities on all the smart TVs and the flat panels in the boardrooms of all my competitors. So there are a number of use cases. We're just not being creative enough in our assessment of what people will do because our guard is down when we're in our home. So,
well, I would say my question is, since I'm usually moderating panels like this myself, so I want to ask some questions too for the security experts on this. Is to me what's interesting is coming from this from analyzing the industry view. This is not something where individual consumers should be required to handle their own security. This has to be enforced at the manufacturer level. And to me, it's interesting that right now the whole Internet of Things is basically a gigantic glacial battle of various standards consortia. You've got Cisco pushing the Internet of Everything and GE pushing the industrial internet, and various people who are fighting this and negotiating in various boardrooms about this. And security is a very low-level discussion of this. And to me, the question is, how do we A, bring that to the forefront with the manufacturers, and B, is there a way to sort of create the sort of nested hierarchies of secure networks inside of homes, so that whatever I bring home doesn't automatically have the same level of access privileges to this? Because these are not new problems. This has been addressed in every government level, military, and even enterprise IT has to deal with this. We just simply we've refused to deal with it.
Well, I would love to probe some of these. One framework we have been using for IoT is a very obvious question is, well, we've solved this in the enterprise, which we haven't, by the way. But the assumption is we've solved this in the enterprise. How is IoT different? And a really simple framework I use is there are different adversaries with different motivations. There are different consequences of failure. There are different operational contexts. You're not going to be behind physical security and perimeters and network layers. There are different compositions of the hardware, firmware, and software used. There's different economics, which is one of the big problems here. And there's different timescales. Yeah. Some of these things, the time to live might be a year. Some of them might be 30 years. Like, how often do you replace your oven, right? Mm-hmm. So those things take some of our best practices and they shatter them. So that is one thing. But within those, I think there's a number of things preventing us from doing very well. What do you guys think?
Yeah, if you look at the corporate IT security apparatus, there's about $80 billion a year spent globally, increasing at about 10% year over year on products and services. I think the total number is around $250 billion if you include IT people. And that's on top of the existing IT investments that are being made. This is just add-on stuff to secure it. Now, if you buy a couple of $100 worth of smart homes gear, are you going to also then buy a couple of $100 worth of security gear and then manage it and maintain it and keep it up? I've done IT stuff. I've done IT security stuff as my day job. When I go home, I don't want to do that, right? So it's like the story of the cobbler's kids have no shoes. I'm going to be one of the worst people who my stuff is going to be woefully unprotected and insecure if you leave it to me to do it. And I know what I'm doing. I'm capable of doing this. I do it professionally. For people like my mom and for other consumers who are less well educated in cybersecurity, what's the hope that they could possibly be able to secure their devices in that corporate IT security space transplanted onto smart home security? One
of the other problems that exists is that we really haven't created the what I might call vigilance infrastructure around security flaws generally, not just in IoT contexts, but more broadly in traditional contexts. So we have certain nomenclatures of assessing the severity of vulnerabilities. We have a numeric system for trying to identify them, but those systems are not scaling optimally, particularly in a world where there are billions of IoT devices. And so these are bigger picture problems about information infrastructure for vulnerability information sharing that we need to bolster and scale and improve in order to be able to get the information in a presentable way, to allow for comparison, head-to-head comparison of products based on security, to help consumers make good security choices. These underlying steps are not yet fully developed. So we like to talk about information sharing frequently in discussions of information security when we're talking about legislative paradigms. But just sharing the existing information doesn't solve the underlying structural deficits that we still need to work through. And IoT is potentially crystallizing the inability of what we're currently using to scale in the best possible way to build our society out with this high degree of connectivity while maintaining the traditional balance of consumer protection and competition in the marketplace.
You know, I'm going to ask one more kind of rapid fire speed round of the panel, and then I'm going to encourage each of you to also ask questions. As far as what to do about it, I agree that we shouldn't, you know, my neighbor is never going to be a security professional, and they never want to have to be the IT person for their own smart home across dozens of devices. So in this, we outlined several recommendations of things that could either add transparency to consumers or add basic expected capabilities to reduce the possibility of harm. What do you think would be, for each of you, is one or more, what do you think would be some good additions, either that we've recommended or elsewhere, that could make it so that we don't have to secure these things, we're getting more inherently secure and defensible things?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is some of the existing consumer practices in non-smart devices, right? One of the things I found was really fascinating in talking to some people in the retail industry is, of course, we go in to buy something and we bombard the people with questions who are there unless we've like done tons of research and we know exactly what it is. And that's also one of the retail folks' big concerns. So if there's some way that a store employee at a retail outlet can be able to have a quick answer of, yes, it's secure, rather than, well, here's what you do. You put this in front of it and you do that. If they can have those quick answers, that helps them sell more product, which goes back to some of the market competition drivers. So if somebody comes into a store and says, what's the most secure X device? And the retail employee can say, oh, it's this one, and I can tell you why in 3 simple bullets, but also, you know, you can read for yourself. I think that that's something that's very powerful that goes up through a retail channel. Barring that, there's remediative action that you can go through if, for instance, someone markets something as a secure webcam or a secure baby monitor, and you find out that it's very much not a secure device. There are ways that you can contact the FTC and report these things, right? So that's maybe not a technical thing, but that's definitely something that my mom could do. And she has done before, to call, you know, the Better Business Bureau or somebody and take that step, which a lot of people don't talk about in our industry, and I think we should talk about those things more.
Okay, who's next?
I'll go. This might be utopian, but I was thinking earlier there was a discussion about recording devices, you know, smart televisions and everything else. This might be apocryphal, but if I recall correctly, the Samsung smart television, where if you read the terms of service, you found that it was recording all of your conversations, and it actually said there at the bottom, do not have personal conversations in front of your Samsung television. And that to me said everything, because rather than have a television that, you know, that didn't record all of your conversations, and rather than have the option to have it not record your conversations, you simply assume the risk that it would record everything you said and it would be used against you. And so to me, the utopian, broader political discussion we need to have is we need to end the current data collection regime, which is the fact that, you know, any hardware maker with their services arm will collect everything they possibly can from you, and they own it. We need to have some sort of scheme, or we need to start altering the schema here to create, that you own your data. Something like, Sandy Pentland's World Economic Forum New Deal on data, or some other approach that would create real legal protections around your data, which would then force the manufacturers and the service providers to then treat it with the appropriate seriousness, rather than, don't have any personal data in front of our devices at any time, because that way you don't have to worry about it being stolen, which is the current regime.
Andrea?
And the prices of devices don't reflect
Right.
accurately the extent
Yes.
of data collection that's happening, which goes to the broader transparency point. I think one other thing that I'll contribute before we open up for questions is the hopeful question mark note that this is a space where technology tools can help to translate concepts for consumers, for policymakers, and for creators of these technologies. We have a robust community of experts who can act as third-party auditors. But sometimes that information doesn't translate well and filter into the public consciousness to inform the less technology sophisticated consumers with respect to the state of the art of what we know to be true in the security research community. Building technology tools, having forums such as this to facilitate that translation effect, both among consumers, but also to help small businesses, creators, better embrace the importance of security by design from the ground up, and to recognize that security isn't something you can slap on at the end of the process. It's not a Band-Aid that can be layered on. It needs to be inherent in the broader structure of the device and the architecture of the device, or it's a lose-lose both for the creator and for the consumer.
Well, a very large thrust of the 5-star for automobile crash tests is that you don't have to know what the difference is between a 3-star, 4-star, or 5-star. It becomes an actionable device for a less informed public to tell relative safety ratings of different vehicles. And that's one of the reasons that our 5-star automotive cyber safety framework wasn't meant to be a checklist of all the security things thou shalt do. It was more of a public attestation of the kind of things you had invested in, such that when the public becomes more savvy or more interested in this as a buyer criteria, they can at a glance in a consistent way tell what people are doing. And several of those are outlined in here as well. But I think one that just came to mind, because I did a webinar on it yesterday, is there actually was a congressional action from Chairman Royce of the House Foreign Relations called the Cyber Supply Chain Management and Transparency Act in 2014, essentially asking for food labels for software. It said if you sell to the government, you should have a bill of materials of the third-party and open source software you use. They shouldn't have any known security defects, and they should be patchable. You can imagine how much the software industry hated this bill. But just yesterday, we did a webinar with the financial services industry, ISAC, where they said that's a great idea. And they basically are now saying to all the big software providers, we want to see a food label of the software that you're selling us in your commercial goods. And that's where they stopped. They didn't ask for the other two things. But what this allows you to do maybe is make a more informed decision. Now, would that be good for my mother-in-law? No. But could that allow organizations to tell who has better or worse hygiene? One thing I am telling all my friends and family to do is if you're going to buy an internet-connected device, it better be patchable. That's a really simple kind of thing to ask for. And the other thing I'm telling them to do is don't buy an internet-connected device if you don't really need it. But I think that part of you must be this tall to ride the Internet of Things is that if you're going to connect it and expose it, you must have the ability to fix it. So with that, is anyone in the audience got a question? We have a microphone. Feel free to also say what you think we should do for the actionable decision making. Go ahead.
So one thing that I'm a security practitioner as well, and one of the things I've noticed is I'm looking at these devices, and I stop for a moment. I think, okay, so if I wanted to see how secure this device right here is, what would I have to do? And I think about it, and I think about it, and I think about it. And compared to what I would have to do for a piece of software on one of my computers or the computer itself or whatnot, it's unbelievable. I mean, and I do this. Like, I have a Sally Logic Pro. Like, I have the gear to do this. I don't want to have to buy 2 toasters and take one of them apart and start, connecting to the pins and, pulling, oh, look, it's a certificate and clear memory, that kind of thing. So I think the problem that calls for the star rating or whatnot, I think it extends farther in this world than it ever has before. It's kind of weird in that there's a level of transparency here that even though these devices are in a way simpler and more ubiquitous, they're even more opaque than the more complex ones that we're used to in cyber.
And moreover, it may be illegal for you to do that analysis, right? Thanks to the Computer Fraud Abuse Act and/or the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, depending on.
DMCA exemption
DMCA.
springs to life.
Yep.
Exemption springs to life at the end of October for
All right.
IoT devices.
So thank you for the comment. Let's take 3 of these and throw them into the melee. Over here. Oh, you can speak loudly. For the video, please. Yeah.
There's a new security research exemption for research on including IoT devices. So security research that conforms to the limitations of the exemption. So basically everything that's a consumer product is loosely covered by this exemption, which allows for the circumvention not being a violation of the DMCA for the purpose of good faith testing and analysis of the code in consumer products such as IoT devices in order to analyze them for the integrity of the code and whether there are flaws.
Can I ask just a follow-up? Can you wait for the mic? Well, my voice is so loud.
It's her recording.
Okay, not for the TV, okay. I'm in a different generation than you are, and we used to play games with people's minds. So if I had something in my house and I knew somebody was monitoring it, I'd just play with the information to have a fun time. But it seems to me now we're passing laws that makes it illegal for, they're collecting information on me and it's illegal for me to play games with their mind. That's what my real question is.
Yeah.
They're going to turn it into a security thing and oh, by the way, you just can't.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the reasons a lot of
What can you do and what
the
can't
research
you do?
community descended upon this cycle of exemptions for the Digital Millennium Copyright Act was to try to, if you look at the white hat hacker community, for example, as an untapped domestic resource that can find find flaws and get them fixed more quickly, then why wouldn't we activate and catalyze that domestic resource? So there were quite a few prominent researchers and patients that tried to get the exceptions for medical devices, which kick in October, automobiles, which kick in October, and this broader category.
Well, why don't you get to the part with messing with them? We're going to see all sorts of messing with smart homes. It's just not going to necessarily be by individuals. So I mean, the example of Tay, Microsoft's Twitter AI run amok, really starts to point to, people messing with your house to turn into a fascist. And we can also start to see, what we've seen already with, Alexa, Amazon Echo's personality, where it's already begun responding to radio and television ads that it overhears. So we can already look forward to, subliminal messaging going into television ads designed to trigger your in-house AI to have it buy things or perhaps attack it somehow. So yeah, we're going to see a lot of gaming of it, but it could happen below the levels of actual individual intervention with it. It's going to be large corporations and AIs messing with each other rather than people.
We could easily have several panels on DMCA and CFAA, but so we probably won't. You were next.
Yeah. Looking at the issues that we've had with industrial control systems, Stuxnet, et cetera, how do we address those before they already happen with smart homes, or can we, or do we just have to wait and see?
That's a good question. So some of the issues that we've had with industrial control systems, I think it's kind of an open secret that they're widely considered highly vulnerable and highly exposed. And there's high consequences from their failure. We saw recently there was an Iranian guy who was charged with hacking a dam. Luckily, apparently the sluice gate was A, not operable remotely, and B, there wasn't that much water actually behind the dam. So I don't know that we'll be able to head off all of those disasters. I don't know what their impacts will be, but I think to have some kind of a plan to respond is really important. Because we'll need to have some kind of response if and when that does happen. But doing all we can before that by having this design layer that takes the security into account is going to be really important.
Being proactive here certainly has a benefit. If we look at other historical legal contexts, for example, in environmental regulation, we needed to wait for a river to actually be on fire. It wasn't until the Cuyahoga River was inflamed that we passed CERCLA and got environmental law on point, and it's one of the most aggressive liability regimes that we have. Rather than waiting for a river on fire event, it might be a more desirable and more logical strategy to be proactive and to think through the optimal pathways for crafting both responsibilities and structures of information transfer before we have a river on fire in information security context.
Yeah, we may not get to it, but one topic that usually comes up here is the lack of any sort of software liability as part of the issue here. It also stymies the activating the insurance world as well to cover residual. But one thing that we shouldn't assume is just because you can connect it to the internet doesn't mean you're required to do so. And especially in industrial control systems, one of the things that I lose sleep over is if you've ever played with Shodan, it's essentially a Google for things that should not be connected to the internet that are, and they often have hard-coded default passwords that you can't even change if you wanted to. So when, I used to say, instead of worrying about sophisticated nation-state attacks on these things, maybe first you should handle Metasploit, which is a free attack tool. So if you can't handle Metasploit, you can't handle anything. Call it H.D. Moore's Law, because he invented it. But then below that, I realized, well, wait a second. We're not even patching known vulnerabilities that have been around for 10 years. The Verizon Data Breach Investigations report about this time last year had this stunning graphic that showed 97% of the successful attacks last year were due to just 10 known vulnerabilities, and 8 of them had had a patch available for more than a decade. And then I say, well, wait, maybe the lower level of minimum hygiene is make sure your industrial control systems aren't nakedly exposed to the internet. So that's the Shodan rule. But I think we have a lot of things that we could and should be doing, but the easiest way to secure that 30-year-old industrial control system is to not have it exposed to the internet. Now, something like Stuxnet, that bridged the air gap because of a bunch of other factors, but we are taking significant elective risks through our really unnecessary elective attack surface. I saw you first, and then you.
Hi, Russell Wald with Stanford University's Hoover Institution. I have a question that there's a lot of focus and talking about software assurance here, but given the fact that the IoT in the home has toasters, ovens, refrigerators, dryers, and washers, we're not looking at hardware assurance as well, and the issues, the vulnerabilities that are embedded within hardware. And since this supply chain for a lot of these things is coming from overseas, what is your thoughts on hardware safety?
Yeah, and a lot of the work that we do when we talk about those differences in adversaries, et cetera, the fourth one rather, is difference in composition. And what we mean there is the hardware, firmware, software stack is wildly different than you might see in an enterprise device. So in some cases there's common componentry, in others it's like you buy a pallet of some embedded Chinese ODM chips for the cheapest that day, and it might be different the next day. So there's no assurance, and given the margins on some of these incredibly small devices, there never is likely to be assurance on some of these things. There is an experiment going on with Underwriters Laboratories to make a cyber seal. The initial round will be on medical devices and industrial control systems at higher price points and more suable entities. But the likelihood, when we talk about different economics for the home and for consumer, this might be an Indiegogo Kickstarter size thing with 2 employees in a garage, and it might be the next thing bought for $3.4 billion, and it doesn't usually get completely scrapped and rewritten later. So this is a particularly pernicious issue, including the hardware that you've referred to.
Well, I was going to say, just an addendum on the hardware, going back to your earlier point about Nest energy fluctuation arbitrage. I mean, then there's that at the bottom end is ODM chips you're just buying off of random auction sites, and then at the high end it's when your Nest is brought to you by Enron, and the entity that's supplying it to you is engaging in various practices that that would be found illegal. Then we have the risk of that too, which is not even hacking. That's just simply manipulation.
Yeah, I think what we're going to end up with is we're going to have some minimum standard of care. Think about like a commercial restaurant, right? You can't just have a commercial restaurant. And even though the hacker community kind of hates any sort of regulation, there are times when the government asserts its will for public safety and the public good in the form of minimum kitchen sanitation code, right? There may end up being something like a gold star seal where it's more of a carrot than a stick or a minimum standard. But we'll have to come to a point where a device that can meet a certain threshold is going to allow discerning citizens to go buy those and only those. It may not be as deterministic as an Underwriters Laboratories seal guaranteeing this won't catch on fire. For one reason, electrical engineering is deterministic and cybersecurity is not. You have sentient adapted adversaries and a whole lot more complexity. But I also think what we're going to end up doing is having to employ a whole lot more segmentation and isolation in the way we set up our dependence. So you don't have to put software and Bluetooth on everything. You don't have to connect it to everything else. But it's going to take us a lot of stumbling and fumbling before we get there. Anybody else for that particular point?
I'll just briefly complement one of your points. So on the point of a minimum standard of care for security, the Federal Trade Commission has instituted a reasonableness standard for security in all companies and in all products as a consumer protection measure. And so their enforcement activity, and there are over 50 enforcement actions with respect to security, and reasonableness is the hallmark of that activity. And there's a report called the Start With Security report that provides a list of practices that have been considered in various enforcement actions, and it's intended partially as an assisting document to startups that are trying to struggle through these questions of hardware and software security in their new devices.
Yeah, there's a sister organization as well I should mention to I Am the Cavalry. It's called BuildItSecure.ly or Build It Securely, and their unique focus is on very small Indiegogo Kickstarter sized projects where they're essentially creating guidance and reference architectures that if you're going to make a device on a Raspberry Pi, here's how you might do it in a secure way, or if you're going to use an Arduino. So they're trying to take popular, small electronic, really low margin IoT platforms and provide free guidance and reference architectures so that there's a better chance of it being done less horribly, better chance of less horribly. All right.
Earlier, you'd also asked about ideas for what we know to do to fix things. And one of the things is I actually am, starting Monday, going to be a cybersecurity analyst for the State Department, and I don't have anything smart in my house. If I were going to have something smart in my house, I would have 3 dumb routers, and I would completely put all the Internet of Targets behind one router on one end of the Y, have the internet actually come through the other, and put anything that I wanted any level of security on a completely different subnet and a completely different branch, probably wired. By the same token, what I'd like to know, and I'd like the opinion of you, is I've thought that considering that some people don't want to use the Internet of Things, to have a mandatory rule or law that every device has a mechanical, non-software controlled on-off switch, so I can shut off the internet and not worry that it can physically, that it can be turned on through software and hacking. No, there's a click to turn off my TV's Wi-Fi, to turn off my refrigerator's Wi-Fi, the oven's Wi-Fi, and so on. If that would be a good, viable first step to help the people who don't have enough security sense. Bo's mom can be told by Bo, hey, Mom, there's a switch. It's right back here. Click it. You'll be fine.
And so it might be smart to switch it to a dumb device, right? Yeah. In fact, we were car shopping about 3 years ago, and I tried to find, even though I knew hackers who had looked at most of the cars, I could not tell which car had the best security program. Now, fast forward 3 years later, we have to get another lease right now, and I know on a first name basis some really intelligent security person at every single car company, and 3 years later I still can't answer what the best programs are. We have little glimpses and pieces, but one of the more stunning moments when I was on a trip was they said to my wife, oh, and this car has 4G LTE Wi-Fi standard in all vehicles. And he said, doesn't that make you want to buy this car instead of the other? And she said, I don't think you know my husband. But then he had the gall to say, well, you could always shut it off. And she goes, I'm not an engineer, but I'm pretty sure I can't shut it off. And the next morning I called and nope, can't shut it off. So I like the idea of the ability to have a less connected mode. In fact, some of the recommendations in here suggest that you should describe to your customers what happens, how much it still functions when it's not connected, or how much what are the fail-safe modes? So if it were compromised, would it degrade to a safer connection state? But these are the kind of discussions we want to stimulate, such that when we start making recommendations to consumer electronics companies, we have at least a list of options they can choose from.
And to help consumers know to ask that question.
That's right.
Because unless you are married to a security pro or study it, you might not even know to ask that question of the car manufacturer, and it's a multi-$1,000 purchase you're investing in, and it's something you care about, but it didn't occur to you to ask. And so to help consumers know which questions to even ask and to put pressure with their buying dollar on companies to have good bug bounty programs in place, to have open door policies with security researchers who find flaws, to have feedback loops, to have information available to consumers about whether there's a kill switch or a human override. If, say, it's an autonomous car and something is going horribly wrong that was simply not anticipated by the coders who were building this device. Code is written by humans. We can't anticipate everything. The same way that I can't write a 50-page paper without making a typo. It just doesn't happen because we're human, and code is written by humans. So sometimes you're going to have mistakes, and I'm a firm believer in the importance of maintaining human overrides in circumstances where an unforeseeable event causes something to go off the rails.
In a lot of industrial control systems in medical, clinical environments, they usually have a requirement for an analog override. And I think we're losing that discipline in some of these other safety critical use cases. And we're going to have to find a way to get it back. All right, I saw Alan was next.
So, Alan Friedman, Department of Commerce. One, just trying to say that there are parts of the government that are strongly encouraging cooperation between vendors and security researchers. But I wanted to talk about what we can do to sort of leverage some of the market forces independent of just command and control regulation. One example I'll fire out is collaboration between the National Association of Realtors and an industrial consortium to have a checklist as you're selling your home. Because if you're buying a new home, you want to know what's in there. And you already know to get the furnace looked at and to get the HVAC system looked at. And there's a checklist to say, okay, well, at least what smart devices are in the home and when were they built? And it's not the best for security because it's not written around security, but it's a good start. So are there other economic forces that we can use to sort of collaborate so it's not just consumer versus vendor, but you can actually get some large, powerful commercial forces on the side of the consumer?
I like your example. One of the things that we talked about a little bit in the paper is kind of the right to be forgotten for homes. When you resell your home, you change the locks, right? When you resell your home, do you delete all the data from the Nest system? That's a personal data about you, essentially. It goes to the new owner. Like, what does that look like? Would you have to just change the entire Nest thermostat because it's tied to your account with your password? Or do you just hand over your password to the new people who move in? Thinking about those things, kind of the entire life cycle of the device in use in a home, and if it's a fridge or an oven or one of those things that tends to survive ownership of the home itself, how do you as a consumer, as that buyer of the new place or the seller of the old place, do that? To Andrea's point, maybe your fridge just keeps buying meat and having it sent to your house, and you're vegans, and so you move in and you just get all this meat shipped to your house. And how do you stop it? You don't have the password for their Amazon account to stop sending it. So what happens? So I like your specific example.
Well, I would say, and building off that, I mean, I'm curious. This goes beyond my ken in terms of the current state of the art. But what are the basic interoperability standards between competing manufacturers? So one of the examples we have in the 2025 quasi nightmare scenario is imagining that you have each room in your house is coming from a separate vendor because you've added to it piecemeal over time. So what happens when your Amazon kitchen stops talking to your Microsoft bathroom because they're at corporate Cold War with each other? What happens when Siri and Alexa and Cortana are all jostling to basically fulfill your competing demands and sending out to software, or perhaps preying on each other and sending white noise? I mean, we have all these things where there's no real guarantees that the manufacturers will at least have guarantees some sort of basic interoperability, other than whatever arrangements they worked out amongst themselves. So I don't know how we legislate the equivalent of a TCP/IP for what the smart home is, or some standards on that. But I don't think that's been looked into enough. Where what happens when the manufacturers go to war with each other, or just glitches between the two, where you have unreproducible, ununderstandable glitches from various rooms because of the way the systems are configured. Every mistake we've ever made with a computing architecture, we're going to now build it into our homes. So that's what we get to look forward to.
Siri, Cortana, and the refrigerator will buy the 50 pounds of meat.
Yeah.
Yes, all of them.
And race to do so in high frequency milliseconds to do it.
So I'd like to take a parallel from automotive lemon laws, right? So the reason the market wasn't efficient was there was information asymmetry where the seller of the vehicle knew more about its history than the buyer. So there was a device put in place that didn't add more information, but maybe gave you an escape clause if you found something with lemon laws. You could argue those aren't necessary anymore now that we have things like Carfax, where there's more transparency about the events and the maintenance that went into that particular vehicle. And that's, at least for our part, specifically if you spent any time with the research community, as I know you have, they're not big fans of legislation or power structures. So, but most seem to be okay with the idea of transparency to enable free market choice. And that's one of the reasons we've tried to talk about food labels or demonstrate if it's patchable. One of the things we're trying to tell people in the meantime, while we don't have 5-star ratings, is I look for vendors who have a coordinated disclosure program. So to your initiative at NTIA, in lieu of other information that I might be able to glean about the automobiles, there's a short list of car companies who have or are about to have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program inviting researchers to report to them. My assumption is someone with that front door welcome mat, instead of an implicit beware of dog sign, is more likely to learn of issues and fix those issues than an organization that doesn't. Now, it's not causal, but it's something that I can act upon, right? So I think one of the strongest issues will be free market forces, and the best way to unlock those, in my opinion, is to have more transparency to enable that free market choice. And then right here.
And the commercial industry for smart buildings and smart kitchens and so forth, they talk about a 35% saving in operating cost. But there's a couple words I haven't heard in this discussion. One of them is IP version 6 is probably necessary. Another is there's a whole list of local and regional building code and building inspector issues that go on in terms of doing that retrofitting is almost impossible. Designing it initially becomes the answer. Another word that probably hits the car thing too is something called EMP, either by terrorists or by natural causes, like a solar flare could bring down the whole network, and then you might not even be able to crawl out of your window. So some of that hardening might be really interesting.
So one of the interesting things that you mentioned that I'll latch onto, maybe I'm taking a point too far in a direction you didn't intend, but if you look at the fleet buyers of automobiles, when they have to do a software update today and it requires physical access to do the update, they have to take that car out of service until they get the update done, right? So if you go to any of the rental car agencies, they might have a fleet of, let's say, 100 cars at that location. How many hours does it take per vehicle if they have to go out and do that? And then when do they take them out of service so that they're no longer producing revenue? So I could see a scenario in the future, you go to a restaurant and say, I'm sorry, we can't serve any food that requires refrigeration because we're waiting on our person to come and update the refrigerator, like in the commercial cooling space.
On your cell phone, they update it at 3 o'clock in the morning and you don't even know that.
Yeah, on your cell phone, they have automatic updates. Maybe there's something that you could do in refrigeration, but then again, that means you must be connected to the internet. And that's one of the things that opens up the greatest potential risk from adversaries. If it's isolated from the internet already, then you have a better window, I would say, to be able to wait, and maybe you don't have to shut down your fridge before you update it. So the connecting to the internet part is what makes you have to shut the fridge down before you can go and use it.
Let's do. Let's take one more question, and then we'll do some closing remarks. And I think you have the mic here.
I'm sort of with Greg on the whole vision of the smart home with the Jetsons, and I want to know where my flying car is. So, but seriously, if you look at cars in the Highway Safety Institute and all the testing they do, until there is some entity that actually tests, I'm not talking about standards, right, that are, quote, voluntary. I'm talking about people who crash things or do the equivalent for the IoT. How my supposition is the consumers will never really know what is safe and what isn't, right? Until there's actual testing. And so in order to accelerate something like that, Josh, you were talking about liability. If you look at places like the Mayo Clinic, who have imposed liability on their vendors, if your software fails and there's a breach, you are liable.
Through
right?
contract, yeah.
Through contract. Unless there's a consumer movement, right, to demand liability on the manufacturer who's bringing something into my home that has this vulnerability known, then I don't. Without those two things, I'm not sure that, just relying on the goodwill of manufacturers to do the right thing, because we know that's simply not going to happen. They'll push product out the door with known vulnerabilities because they can.
So here's where we get into interesting legal territory. When we're talking about physical objects, a chair, a table, traditionally a refrigerator, there have been certain protections as a matter of law under the version of this thing called the Uniform Commercial Code that's been incorporated by state legislatures implicitly into all contract law. And that gives consumers certain rights of recourse. You can reject products, for example, that arrive to your door that are not conforming to what they were supposed to be when you purchased it. So we have these kinds of protections for physical objects, but then over here in code land, software has generally been shared with these end user license agreements that say you use it at your own risk, whatever happens, not our problem. And when it was the chapter of your latest book that got lost when you got the blue screen of death on your laptop, you were annoyed, but you kind of dealt with it. But the blue screen of death on a medical device
Could be death.
that's IoT is real death, right? And so here we have this physical space norm of liability and a higher level of consumer protection because of the information disparities. And over here we have this as is, where is norm for software. And these two norms are clashing in the IoT context. And that's what we need to resolve. Courts are going to need to struggle with this, and that's where the rubber is hitting the road in the IoT car, I guess. Sorry for that.
Yeah, and as a teaser for maybe a future discussion, one of the ways I met Andrea a couple of years ago was posing the question of, is software liability the worst possible idea except for all others? And especially when it comes to bits and bytes, meat, flesh, and blood, as we are now encountering. So the basic thesis is you want to place the cost burden on the party in the best position to avoid the risk, and then they can offset the residual risk with insurance levers we have elsewhere. So this will come to a head. Maybe it's the first kid getting hit by a self-driving car, but I think IoT is what will trigger said condition, and it's better to have a plan before that moment than to have a knee-jerk reaction afterwards. Let's just do a 30-second closing remarks from each of you in any particular order, and then let's have some.
I just want to refer to what she said, where she said it took a river on fire to really trigger protections like that. I think it's going to take another fire to create exactly the kind of sort of national safety boards. I mean, I think it's telling. As someone who's written a lot about air travel in a previous life, I think I absolutely agree. I would love something like the National Transportation Safety Board for the Internet of Things, where when I board flights, I sleep like a baby on them because I know it's the safest thing I can possibly do, given the oversight of it. It would be interesting to have something like that, and a plane crash, which creates zero tolerance, and also has what Taleb would call an anti-fragile culture, where there's a real culture to improve it and make sure it never happens again, to patch all those vulnerabilities. I don't know what it would take to create a cultural shift like that, but I think that would be a great thing. And I don't know what it takes to a glitch that a nest that burns down entire neighborhoods across America, something like that. I don't think it would be a cyber attack because we can blame someone. I don't even know if we could blame hackers, but some horrific fatal glitch or death or property damage might be what it takes.
Well.
So kind of drawing on your point a little bit, you said that The manufacturers won't do this out of the goodness of their hearts. And not only that, they can't. There's a fiduciary responsibility of management to return investment to the shareholders. Until security becomes a monumental or significant financial issue for organizations, maybe they can't. And maybe that's one of the spaces we should start looking at more is how do we make cyber safety a financial issue for organizations with carrots, sticks, market demand, whatever it might take. That might shape and shift the landscape more than some of the other things that we might do.
So my final thought is coordination opportunities. Playing on that last point, while some entities will argue our fiduciary duties require us to maximize profits and cut corners on security, different organizations will argue long-term maximization of corporate value instead requires investment in R&D and building the products that will engender loyalty from our customer base and keep them safe. So coordinating, rewarding those kinds of behaviors across all parts of our ecosystem. For example, the Securities and Exchange Commission has issued guidance that strongly encourages / requires disclosures of material breaches of security by publicly traded companies. They've made some comments that perhaps the disclosures in the 10Ks are not quite to the level that they were hoping for. But coordinating the information in the marketplace that's coming from Part A of the enterprise with the lawyer-generated disclosures that are coming from Part B and looking for the big picture story about how an entity cares about security or doesn't care about security and what affirmative measures are they taking to be the best version of themselves in order to help consumers stay safe, to engender a sense of trust in the marketplace, and to nudge forward innovation in a way that bolsters our economy as a whole rather than compromises our information flows.
All right, so I want to end on a kernel of hope, tying a few things together that we've heard. At our first Constitutional Congress for I Am the Cavalry, Andrea, Bo, and some others in this room were there, and Andrea told the whole room it was going to take a death. It was going to take a river on fire before anyone would listen. And our stubbornness said, you know what, we're going to try, we're going to build relationships and trust, and we're going to use empathy. And we want to be safer sooner together. And sitting right there, right next to Suzanne Schwartz last year, started a pretty intense exchange of education and awareness between the industries. And when we talked about it, she said it would take proof of harm of a medical device to trigger a corrective action. So similar to your point, dead bodies. But the week before the week before DEF CON, they issued the first ever, essentially a recall, a safety communication on a Hospire drug infusion pump with zero proof of harm because through that dialogue they concluded that an unmitigated pathway to harm was sufficient to trigger a corrective action, and now in the guidance. So the idea of saving lives when waiting for really bad things to happen, we're stubborn enough that we're not going to wait for that, and I think discussions like this and collaborations will allow us to be safer sooner together. And for now, this is to catalyze the discussion, and let's take it to the next stage in the foyer. Thank you for your time, and thanks to the panelists.
That was great. Thanks.